Welcome to the Way Forward webinar series, brought to you by United States Heartland China Association. The topic today is mission critical infrastructure. I want to thank our partners, American Society of Civil Engineers, Tennessee China Network, and Washington State China Relations Council, whose partnership made this possible. I'm going to turn to our host today, US Heartland China Association board member Jim Schultz, founder of Open Prairie, to lead us through the rest of the session. Jim?
And thank you. And Governor Bob Holden should be thanked also for putting together this organization. I've been a proud board member for the past 2 years. And as we talked about putting this panel together of mission critical infrastructure, I reflected on a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to travel the Mississippi River by barge and to see our lock and dam system and the need for upgrade and some of the deteriorating situations along the Mississippi River with our locks. So I think today's panel is going to be a very interesting opportunity for us to learn more and how that ties to trade and how that ties to opportunity to collaborate with our partners in China. I'm going to introduce our four panelists, and then we're going to move into some questions that have been pre-submitted and some questions that we created. But as you can see on the screen that Min has in front of us, the four panelists are very well qualified. What I'm going to do is go from left to right and ask each of you to introduce yourself. So Spencer, I'll turn to you. Could you please give a brief intro of your background?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Spencer Cohn. I'm a senior economist with a Seattle-based consulting firm called Community Attributes. So we're a consulting firm based in Seattle that's focused on data analytics and economic impact research and analysis for a whole slew of different clients and organizations. We do a lot of work with trade and with ports and a lot of work with port infrastructure as part of our work. So thanks for the opportunity to participate today.
Thanks, Spencer. And Robin, could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, for me, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here today. I am a licensed professional engineer. My background, most of my career, 35 years, was spent in structural engineering building design, which is part of civil engineering. But I am currently one of the 3 presidential officers for the American Society of Civil Engineers. I'm in my last 3rd year as the past president. And as civil engineers, we were extremely involved in the infrastructure. And my current role that I did change a bit from a professional side is now I'm a risk engineer for Zurich, North America, which is an insurance company that is, if not the largest, close to companies that deals with the construction world. So we're out there all the time looking at infrastructure that is going to, whether from the design side or the construction side. So I really look forward to having our discussion today. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Robin. And Doug, I'll hand it to you.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jim and Min for organizing, and the USHCA for pulling this panel together. Very happy to be a part of it. As Jim mentioned, I'm Doug Brate. I'm the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're an innovation-focused think tank located in Washington, D.C., nonprofit, nonpartisan education institute. We focus on formulating, evaluating, and promoting public policies that we think advance innovation, both in the U.S. And abroad, with the sort of core belief that innovation is the key factor to achieving broader economic growth and really human flourishing long term. So I bring to the panel a real focus on broadband and wireless infrastructure. Thanks again. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Doug. And finally, last but not least, Mina, I'll turn it to you if you can give a brief intro.
Good morning. I'm very excited and honored to be here. My name is Mina. I'm a faculty of Computer Science Department at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. I'm also the founding director of the Center for Urban Informatics and Progress, COIP, here at UTC. COIP focuses on data-driven approaches for smart city research, which we focus on energy, mobility, and health. And our goal is to make urban livable, accessible, and healthy for all. We want to make sure that this is not just based on technology, human behavior, and also citizens are involved in the research that we are working on. We focus on applied research. that contribute to the smart city research literature as a whole, and also how can it be applied for the well-being of the citizens as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Mina. What we're going to do is now have what we call a couple of anchoring questions that are the basis for the panel today, and then we'll move into some of the Q&A that were previously submitted. But one of the key questions that I think all of us talked about and think is important is remaining competitive globally. And the question, and Spencer, I'll come to you first. What are some of the things that we need to do, or what are some of the challenges we have with our infrastructure in the heartland that need to be corrected to make ourselves more competitive globally?
Well, so I think a lot about ports and structure and the relationship between the two. And so there are a couple big trends that I see from my vantage point with respect to trade and competitiveness. And so firstly, there's changing trade system. So we're seeing that there's been a lot of reconfiguring of supply chains across the globe. A big part of that's been the US-China trade war. So there's been an increasing amount of pressure on US companies to reconfigure their supply chains away from China. That's mostly applicable for companies that are not selling into the China market. So those companies who are there mostly for low wage, low cost investment in production opportunities. But that's going to really, on the margins, you could see companies that move their production, for instance, to other parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Latin America, even Eastern Europe. And so that's going to impact the directional flow of a lot of product coming into and from the US. There's also, though, a lot of new sources of demand. So, last year, the US economy exported $130 billion worth of ag products across the globe. A lot of that, as we see, with soybeans to China, for instance, the US has, farmers have taken a big hit from the trade war, whether it's soybeans or wheat or other products. But if that continues over time, if we continue to see what's referred to as economic decoupling with China, for instance, that's going to create a lot of pressure on US farmers, for instance, to explore other opportunities in other markets for their goods. So having a system in place and finding ways, as we see new directions for where that product is going, is going to create new kinds of pressures on the kinds of infrastructure and the trade flows and the kinds of systems we need, whether it's intermodal, whether it's, maritime, marine, that are going to impact where those products are going to be going, for instance. Especially, in the case of the US-China relationship, it's going to become increasingly, even no matter who's in the Oval Office next year. The last thing is really, COVID-induced changes on the economy, of course. So looking, what does it mean in terms of how people work and commute and where, how they recreate and impacts that'll have on our road systems could also have an impact. So those are really the challenges I see globally are going to be, most importantly, going to be the changes to sort of the global sort of demand sources and the US-China relationship.
Excellent. Thank you, Spencer. Robin, I'll turn to you and ask the same question about the infrastructure and what we can do to make sure we stay competitive globally.
Well, first and foremost, we have to have a very fine and vibrant and working infrastructure. And whether it's the heartland or across the US, our infrastructure is aging. And we have many systems that are suffering from chronic underinvestment. So we've essentially taken a generation off from paying and maintaining for our infrastructure. And we are really seeing what happens when you do that, whether it be potholes, whether it be lack of clean water, whether it be the grid crashing periodically. So it's really a problem that we have not maintained our infrastructure, no less expanded it where needed. ASAE, the American Society of Civil Engineers, we issue a national report card every 4 years, and our next one's coming out this March. And we give various grades, just like a school report card, A through F. And we currently are at a D+. And we were that was in 2017. And it was a D+ 4 years before that. And we're just trying to get to a B where we're in good working order. So obviously we are not making progress. It'd be very interesting to see what happens in March. But there is good news. how do we become globally competitive? We have to make sure that we are competitive within our own nation first. There are areas where there has been significant renewal. Our ports and rails, for example, did do better in the last 4 years. So in that sense, and that's very critical to be global, because as Spencer was talking about the supply chain and everything, you need to be able to move goods as part of our economic growth. And the infrastructure is so core to our economic growth. So that's why we really have to start investing.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. Robin, I mentioned I traveled on a barge down the Mississippi, and I was struck by some of the size of the holes in some of the locks. I mean, they were cannonball size holes. And so to your point, we need to put more dollars there. So Doug, tell me a little bit about your perspective on this question, if you would.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, being the broadband guy on the panel, it might come as a surprise that I think the key technology to remaining globally competitive for the Heartland is broadband connectivity. I feel like people recognize the importance of broadband for a long time, but that has only become more acute with the COVID pandemic and so much of our lives transitioning, to the extent it hadn't already, to moving online, whether it be work, education, socializing, whatever. It seems like it can be difficult even to place a restaurant order without having some sort of connectivity tool. And so to my mind, broadband is really the key infrastructure challenge remaining for parts of the US Heartland, especially those rural areas outside of cities where the sort of economics of density make it more lucrative, easier for private investment to build out the sort of top tier broadband connectivity tools within the city. So a lot of the Heartland's rural areas, I think, are still facing challenges with rural broadband infrastructure. And to that point, the main challenge is upgrading some of the legacy networks that were built for telephone connectivity, upgrading those so that they can have a much higher performance broadband connectivity. On the wireless side, I think it's also incredibly important. There are so many beneficial spillover effects: smart agriculture, smart transportation, to having wireless connectivity. And with that, 5G is sort of the latest and greatest, at risk of perhaps being overhyped, but an incredibly important technology. And again, there's real challenges, especially to getting that sort of technology built out into rural areas. Part of the transition to seeing the sort of highest performance flavors of 5G is this transition from what used to be very tall, 200-foot tall macro towers that you'd see driving down the highway, to much smaller and much more numerous, less obtrusive, but much more of what are called small cells, is small cell infrastructure. So that transition requires a rethinking of all sorts of regulatory policy, investment policy, and all sorts of challenges in seeing that transition to a much faster, higher performing 5G wireless network. Yeah, I think those are the two big challenges to remaining globally competitive, to my mind.
Excellent. Thank you. And finally, Mina, your perspective on some of the challenges for the infrastructure of the Heartland.
I think my perspective on the challenge is more from the accessibility side. Heartland region is an enormous area. It's much larger than many of the countries out there. And within Heartland, I think transportation over long distance is really depend on the economic factors, meaning that if you have the budget for it, you will fly. If not, if you have the time, you would be driving. So there are no really substantial or accessible and affordable mass transit system within the Heartland that people can rely on. And even if we look at it as more of a local level, many cities are not large enough to support the accessible public transit infrastructure as basic, at least as the way it is currently defined and conceived. I think it's where that we must be investing in new technologies and methods that it can create affordable and accessible public transit. And the current conception of the public transit only seems to work on bigger cities now. I think for a small or mid-size, it seems like it's a patchwork of inefficient methods. There are a lot of solutions and methods or like suggestions out there, but they're not really connected or cohesive and integrated that it can be applied and it can be relied on and people can use it in an accessible and affordable way.
Excellent. Thank you to all the panelists for those observations and some of our challenges. If we put politics aside, and I know in this hyper social media time we live where it seems like by the moment there's some new bomb being thrown at somebody, if we go back to the mission of the organization to foster and support a positive and productive and mutually beneficial relationship between United States and China, how do we take these challenges and create them and make an opportunity for both sides? And any perspective on that would be helpful if you could share that with the audience we have. Mina, maybe I'll start with you this time if that's okay. So turn to you to maybe give us some of your observations and thoughts on some of the opportunities to work together.
Sure. I think one of the things is perhaps maybe lack of funding and prioritization. I mean, in terms of a lot of infrastructure that we talked about and Robin mentioned, there's a lot of work that individually or collectively the researchers are working on, for example, autonomous or self-driving vehicles or navigation apps, car sharing. But like there are a lot of works doing there, but we're not doing much on a physical infrastructure actually. So are we where are the funding always is a challenge there, and how are we prioritizing those? And these are more maybe in the sense of the actual infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but I think also in terms of digital infrastructure, security is always going to be a major challenge there. As we talk more about the accessibility, the connectivity that that Doug was talking about, and going more toward smart and connected communities, I think that the security would be a major challenge that we need to be working on that.
Excellent. And Robin, same question. If we forget about the politics and say, how do we, in esprit de corps, create more opportunities between China and the United States, particularly as it relates to this infrastructure issue? What do you see are some opportunities for collaboration?
Well, I think we already have them. It's a question of whether the politics have gotten involved and able to use them. I mean, the U.S. produces products that are used worldwide, including China. And we also use the raw materials and other products that come out of China and other places of the world. For the global collaboration, it's similar to what's going on. You talk to Doug, you talk to Mina, you talk to Spencer. I mean, what are we talking about? For the future of the infrastructure, we're really talking about what we call systems engineering. It's not these silos, I mean, civil engineering is the basis of the infrastructure out there. People cannot live without clean water. You talk about doctors and how they save lives. Civil engineers touch every person's life, everybody around the world, because of things like clean water and wastewater systems and things like that. So what we need to make sure is that, you have to look beyond and saying, what is benefiting everybody? We can't benefit our own nation if we're not looking what's going else out in the rest of the world. If you ever read The World is Flat, you will really understand how things have changed over time. So we cannot be, in my opinion, isolationists, because the economy is interconnected, and that's what's core to survival of people, is being able to have those core things to make life livable, such as the clean water, such as being able to get to work, whether it's through the internet, which we're doing a lot today, or whether it's through the roads or mass transit. So, we have to make sure that we're keeping our communities healthy. Mina talks a lot about how you have to talk about the communities. That's all part of sustainability. It's what's best for the communities and the economy, and also the environment. And that's something we all need to do in order to keep the supply chains moving between all our nations.
Excellent. Spencer, maybe the same question about opportunities for collaboration, if you would.
So I think that there's, kind of wrapping on, I think, what's already been said, but I do think that first and foremost, the big challenges for collaboration is going to be resolving our issues with China and resolving and overcoming a lot of the mistrust that's going on right now. Right now, U.S.-China relations are at a very historic low since normalization, or at least since 1989. And so getting some resolve on a relationship with China is really critical, because China's been such an active player in global infrastructure, primarily through the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a $1 trillion project or policy framework initiated by President Xi Jinping in 2013. they're really the big player right now, and China's also been really active took the lead in the formation of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is really seen as a complement more than a challenge, I think, to the other existing institutions that support infrastructure investments, such as the World Bank. So there's a huge need for global infrastructure investments, and so the U.S. and China can be partners, or at least collaborate. Maybe not even at country to country, but certainly, for U.S. private companies working with Chinese companies, for instance. And we've seen that a bit in China, actually, because China has their own huge infrastructure needs that are not met by Chinese domestic companies. So, for instance, stormwater management. So China's cities are traditionally heavily industrialized cities, lots of pavement. They were not designed or planned for hand lots of flow of stormwater. And so you get this cistern effect where you get this huge accumulation very quickly of water. So there are US companies that have actually been involved already over the years in working with Chinese companies to invest and design stormwater systems, including even a company here in Seattle, really in their $300 billion project or program in China called the Sponge City Initiative. That's part of that. So that's one. Certainly on collaboration, green infrastructure. So last week was the General Assembly of the UN celebrating its 75th anniversary. And President Xi Jinping made a very bold pledge for China to expedite its commitments in the Paris Accord, which we're not part of right now, of course, but made a very bold prediction or pledge for China to, which had previously set a target of 2030 for carbon emissions peak, to expedite that. He didn't give a specific date or time, but he said before 2030. And then also said that China is going to fast forward and be carbon neutral by 2060. So a big part of that's going to be green infrastructure. And in addition to China trying to take the lead or its own commitments, it's going to be more active globally through the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, to promote in other initiatives. There could be opportunities for the US if we were to re-engage with China, re-engage on the Paris Accord and other agreements to help invest in carbon emissions reduction technology and infrastructure. And then, lastly, there's just a huge demand for infrastructure. The latest estimates are between 2018 and 2030, about $26 trillion worth of demand for new infrastructure in the developing world. Right now, the US spent last year about $34 billion in foreign aid, and only a small fraction of that was actually in the form of infrastructure. So there's huge opportunity to collaborate, not just with China, but other countries, really re-engage and try to invest and help with more global infrastructure investments. I would say too, just one last point is that, again, I think that the port infrastructure is really evolving and changing. We're seeing that in the Northwest with the advent of much larger cargo vessels. So we're seeing fewer vessels, but much larger vessels. I mean, these are the so-called post-Panamax vessels that are way too big to go through the expanded Panama Canal. And so we're seeing these vessels that are upwards of 18 to 20,000 TEUs in capacity. So that's really also shifting the dynamics for port infrastructure as well. We're getting a lot of competition from Canadian ports, especially. So Prince Rupert and Port Vancouver are taking a lot of market share from the Northwest. So again, thinking about where do we collaborate, both also domestically, but on port infrastructure as well, to really address some of these growing, evolving challenges in supply chains and the shipping industry.
Spencer, thanks. And hopefully we can touch more upon the Belt and Road Initiative in some of the questions later on. And I know next week you're going to be presenting a panel on the Belt and Road Initiative and how that might tie to U.S. infrastructure. Is it this week? Excuse me. Maybe Min can flash that up on our screen and show people when that is. I apologize. But I'll turn to Doug. And again, hopefully, Spencer, we can spend a little more time on that topic in our conversation today. Doug, to the same question about how do we seize this as an opportunity instead of staring at the politics of it all. What are your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah. No. I appreciate all the other panelists' reactions. That's very interesting. I would say, first of all, I mean, it's like if only we had that magic wand, right? I mean, putting politics aside, right? It's like to my mind, so often like that's kind of the whole thing is the politics, the art of the possible, and what we can actually achieve. But thinking about global collaboration, especially when it comes to US and China, I think Spencer hit on it. I think, to my mind, the keyword is trust. That is in very short supply these days. I feel like on both sides of that relationship, especially trust when you talk about looking at some of the developments of high technology standards themselves. And to my mind, is sort of like gazing into the future. That's where a lot of the sort of, especially development of the digital components of infrastructure are really crucial. And so I feel like working to develop trust, both in global relations and trade generally, but particularly in standard setting organizations. And that, to my mind, really requires an adherence to both the rules and the spirit of the rules of these sort of global organizations. Standard setting organizations, like in my role, very important for 5G, 3GPP standard setting, but also in kind of outside of my ambit, but the World Trade Organization and other sort of global rules and standards-based bodies working to develop trust and avoid fragmentation. And further fragmentation, both of the sort of technology and the components that go into digital infrastructure, but also fragmentation of the sort of internet governance level, I think is a potential real challenge. We've seen in the last few weeks this all of this Sturm and Drang over the TikTok and WeChat, which to my mind is risks sort of a race to the bottom. I'd rather those sort of decisions be made on a very clear risk-based analysis. To the extent that there is a real risk involved, that those challenges were made public and clear, so that we were hewing to clear standards that could be aimed towards policy reciprocity. So those are some of the opportunities, I think, for overcoming some of what I think are big challenges around trust long term. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Jim, if I could just add a point to
please.
that. I mean, it's a small one, but ASAE has 150,000 members worldwide, including China, and especially the students. And I had the privilege of going to a student conference in China. So we have members there. We just created a greater section, we call it Greater China section, to try and get them more engaged, because the restrictions of actually having an ASAE entity in China directly. But we do have the students, and that may sound like something small, but a lot of them have come to the US over the years with competitions and interacted with students from around the US and Mexico and Canada. And I think, it sounds like very small, but you want to talk about garnering trust and building those relationships. This is our future generation we're talking about. So I know it's only a few people compared to the sizes of, China is much bigger than we are and all that, but I think it's a core philosophy and way to go about it. You do start one-on-one and then it spreads. So hopefully, what we do in these organizations, whether it's ASAE or others, really will help develop those relationships and keep the collaboration going, politics aside.
Thank you for the additional comment, Robin, and Doug, thanks for those insights. I remind everyone, please use the chat feature. Brian Goldbeck, I see you've got a question up there. I'm going to potentially I'll ask Spencer maybe to touch upon that question in the next section, which is our focus area 1, talking about national strategy and priority. But before I go to the question that Brian submitted, Robin, would you talk a little bit about our infrastructure? You said that it's a pretty sad state. The infrastructure is graded at D+, and I know if one of my children came home with that grade, I'd be very displeased. Is it still worth it to patch the existing infrastructure, or is there a better plan maybe to just ditch the whole thing and start over? And can we afford it? Can you talk about that a little bit, Robin?
Yeah, it's a very big question. I'll try to make it concise. As I said, in 2017, the last report card nationally was a D+, and it was that 4 years before in 2013. Yes, it's not so much patching, but maintenance is core. That is core. That is the first line of defense. And that's what we have given up in this generation. And we have to go back to that. We can't start over. I mean, we good or bad, after World War II, or the countries that got a lot of destruction, they were able to almost start from scratch and build their infrastructure. So we're building on things that have been around for a while. And that's not a bad thing. We really have to look at the life cycle costs. Those have to do with the cost of a project from its very inception till actually when it's either no longer in use or demolished or whatever. And you know, I know it's hard. It's hard to think about. If you only have $1 in your pocket to spend, that's what you think you have. But if you find that second dollar, you know, $1 in the pocket may cost $100 for that project throughout its useful life. You either do the maintenance or whether it's not going to be sufficient in a few years and you're going to have to expand it or whatever. But if you find that second dollar, if you look at those life cycle costs, it may only cost you $50. And that we have to really start making sure that we're doing that. That's other way to save money. The other things is asset management. I think Mina has looked into this. You got to prioritize. If you have good asset management programs, you know, you're looking at what you have and where the needs are and where they're going to be in the future so you can look towards it. But we also have another thing. You want to talk about how we have to collaborate. We have a global problem. It's called climate change. And that's affecting our infrastructure. So we also not only have to look to what we have and how to make it work for today, but we have to figure out how to make it work for tomorrow. So now we have to look at things of how do we predict something that is unpredictable. So we have to design things and maintain things looking towards the future, saying things may change, so are we going to have that flexibility to do it? So those are a lot of the things that we have that are that need to be done. But it's certainly worth saving our infrastructure, but there'll be times that you do need to replace or expand.
Excellent. And kind of a related matter, I guess, you know, as we look to 2021, we'll have either a new president or we'll have Trump 2 administration. If you could wave the wand and go to either administration, what would be some of the infrastructure legislation that you'd propose for a bill in 2021?
Well, both the presidential candidate and our current president, President Trump, have talked about infrastructure. Actually, President Trump is really the first president who has put forth the idea of a more complete infrastructure package. You know, we have a lot of pieces to infrastructure out there, whether it's the wastewater, whether it's the water, whether it's the dams, whether it's the roads, whether it's mass transit, you know, they're all separate pieces. So he's talked about it, we just haven't gotten there. Obviously with Congress has passed a lot of legislation for infrastructure. The problem is the appropriations. They haven't passed the money part. And I didn't know this till I became a presidential officer at ASAE that was how Congress worked. So, you know, so it's bipartisan. So there's both candidates have looked towards infrastructure, both have talked about it. It still, in my mind, boils down to getting the necessary appropriations moving forward, and that means working with Congress.
Excellent. Spencer, any thoughts on these series of questions, and maybe also the question that was asked by one of our guests about the ports and some of the need for improvement there, particularly as it relates to trade changing from China to other countries?
Yeah, so I'm not much of a prognosticator on DC politics, but I do want to highlight two things about 2021. So firstly, government debt is incredibly cheap right now. You know, for instance, 10-year treasuries fell from 3.4% down to about 0.66%. So we're at historic lows for the cost of borrowing for the government. I'm not advocating for huge government debt per se, but it's typically it's a good time if you want to invest in infrastructure and borrow and make significant investments. These are historically low cost of capital for government right now. The same point is that there's definitely high demand for infrastructure improvements. So I'd certainly look at projects. Infrastructure is a typical or a common form of stimulus. And we've seen, sometimes stimulus or the stimulus purpose of the investment overrides the rational decision around why to invest in one thing versus another. So just having a sharper perspective on what we want to invest in and to use those investments as a form of stimulus, but also, as Robin was saying, these are long-term investments that could yield significant return for our economy, for our infrastructure system. With respect to the ports, so I mentioned before about how there's been a lot of, the port shipping industry is evolving, as I mentioned. So we've seen that, as I mentioned, cargo vessels are getting much bigger. There are fewer vessels. So there's a lot more competition, especially on the West Coast in the shipping industry. And so investing in facilities that can handle these larger ports. So in Seattle, where I'm from, where I'm calling from, the ports of Seattle and Tacoma are what's called the Northwest Seaport Alliance, which is an alliance between the two ports, have made a huge investment in one of the terminals to expand it to accommodate some of these much larger vessels. And it's really a necessity because that's really been the direction of the industry globally, is moving into these much bigger vessels. And we're competing with Prince Rupert, which is way up north in BC, but close to the Alaskan border and close to Southeast Alaska. And then with Port of Vancouver. And those ports have an advantage over the Northwest ports because they don't pay what's called the harbor maintenance tax. So if you ship a product through Canadian ports and you put on Canadian rail and ship it across the border for consumers or your importers in Chicago, it's cheaper to provide that shipment because they don't pay a similar tax or same level when it crosses the border by rail, whereas ports of Seattle Tacoma have to pay, or the shippers have to pay that tax. So, thinking about, again, really the competition for a lot of those, those new shipping trends, and investing in that capacity. The other thing, I think a part of the question was about the reconfiguring of supply chains. I still believe that, despite all the rhetoric and the hopes that the trade war is going to somehow induce a lot of major manufacturers to relocate outside of China, is not realistic. I think for a lot of reasons. Firstly being that, most of those companies are increasingly invested in being in China to access the Chinese domestic market, in addition to shipping or just simply producing as an OEM and shipping abroad. Also, China has an extensive last mile logistics that even if it's cheaper to produce in Vietnam, for instance, a lot of those countries don't have that kind of capacity to absorb that much manufacturing. And if they do move too, they're not going to come back to the US, most likely. They're going to relocate that production to other parts of the world, typically where there's low cost production. But that is something we should track, because if there is a shift, for instance, say there's more movement of a lot of textile production, for instance, and other products to places such as Southeast Asia that were previously in Northeast Asia, in China, that'll really disrupt potentially on the margins some of the shipping lanes or shipping flows and volume of trade. So ports are going to have to be more creative about how to attract additional trade and activity in their areas. So, and it has a huge economic impact, because I know in Washington State, what we call the Global Trade and Supply Chain Management System, which includes your stevedoring, intermodal operations, warehousing, even fulfillment centers, employs about freight forwarding. It employs about 100,000 workers, direct workers across the state. And I mentioned that's a similar trend or a similar phenomenon in the Midwest as well, especially with the lock system and rail and so forth.
Great, thank you, Spencer. Hey, Robin, one last question, and we're trying to move on to the next section quickly, but in the financing of infrastructure, are there any creative models? And also we have a question from Ifei Chang about ways to look at financing beyond return on investment. I think we're all, as finance people, accustomed to that, but are there other ways to measure how the success of an infrastructure project might be measured beyond finance? So creative financial models and other ways to measure.
Well, there's definitely many financial models out there, more so than there had been in the past. I believe President Trump talked a lot about the P3, public-private partnerships. That is just a piece of it. It's just like anything else. There's no silver bullet. It's a combination. It's taking local investment, whether it be the municipality, the county, the state, and federal. A lot of the states have put up, in the last, I think it's 6 years, there have been 36 states that have raised the gas tax. We're still stuck in the 1990s, and it hasn't been raised. So federal hasn't been doing their side of it. I had the opportunity of traveling a lot our country as a presidential officer, and you could see and you could talk to people, and I'm sure Mina can talk about it, especially from Chattanooga, how much investment is going on locally, because they're realizing you can't always wait for the federal government. We still need their help. We still need their support and investment. And they have it, like we have the LATIFIA, which is the Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. The GARVES, Grant Anticipation Revenue Vehicles, and there's railroad ones and for wastewater. So there are packages out there. Again, it a lot has to do with the appropriations, making sure we have the money to fund them. Let me just talk real quickly about a particular project in Florida. And it was a public-private partnership. And it was the Florida Department of Transportation, and it was the Port Miami Tunnel Project. So talking about ports a lot. And the tunnel mining began in 2011. The bottom line is it was a 35-year concession agreement. That means that the people, the partnership is running it for 35 years. And that's where the money gets put back. But they did not have to put the money up front. A lot of it, there were milestone payments made by the Florida Department of Transportation and even some other groups, and the state agreed to pay for half of the capital costs. So what it is, it's bundling. It's bundling money from all different sources, and that's what has to be. Is it innovative? I don't know. Is it creative? I think so. It's taking what we have and making the most of it. And you had a second part to that?
Just, is there another way to measure success beyond return on investment? What are some metrics that you would look to and say, hey, that is a successful project beyond the finance part?
Well, to me, it has to do sustainability and resiliency. And when we talk about sustainability, there are many definitions, but we talk about the triple bottom line, the three-legged stool, the three parts, the social, what does the community really want and need? Equity has been a big word that's come out recently in months, but that's part of it. Not just equitable, but how do you provide equity for the community? Making sure it's economic, that's that return on investment part I believe the person was referring to. And then the environmental, how do we make sure that whatever we do today will not harm the future generations? And if you balance those three as best as possible and move them as far out as possible, to me, that is a very successful project. But if you only have one piece of it, not so much.
Great answer. Thank you. I'm going to change it subject now to our second topic, and that's broadband and 5G. And Doug and Mina have some perspective on that. But Doug, one of the things interesting to me, on some of our farms, they're so rural that access to the internet is not possible. And sharing data and receiving data on tractors or combines is a real problem. Talk a little bit about how COVID-19 has demonstrated that we all can adapt to this new normal. I mean, if, a year ago we would all met in person, had this panel assemble and somewhere in Indianapolis or St. Louis or somewhere, but we're not. We're doing it all virtually, and we're working from home, but we're still engaging globally. Talk about some of these changes and decision making on infrastructure and equity of access for people that maybe are not as or so to speak disenfranchised, I'll say, because they don't have internet access or 5G. Talk a little bit about that, Doug, and some of the solutions.
Sure, yeah, happy to talk, always happy to talk about broadband. So we actually put out, not too long ago, a recent report we titled Lessons from the Pandemic that looked at a lot of these questions around, how our broadband system has fared under this sort of natural experiment where we saw a jump in demand by 20–30% as everyone sort of moved online, staying at home under the pandemic. There's, long-standing, high-level broadband policy debates about the right way to go about regulatory policy, whether you want a more utility model or a more competition-based model, competition policy, all sorts of those questions. And so to my mind, it's like we had this rare sort of natural experiment where we had a kind of stress test of the network, so we could look at and see how systems across the world that engage in those policy decisions in different ways, how that dealt with the strain, to the extent there was strain, put on the networks during the stay-at-home order. So I thought it was pretty interesting. I don't want to overstate this. The U.S. did see a better performance than many of its peer countries. Many nations did fairly well, and it's really those nations that were able to invest through different means in in upgrading their infrastructure to more modern technology. But the U.S. Did remarkably well, especially compared to some of its peer nations in Europe that depend on a more sort of utility style model. U.S. We have private competition, dynamic competition, largely between two networks that originally built the telephone network, the copper telephone network, and the cable, the coax-based television network. So we were able to have dynamic competition between those two network players as compared to some countries that don't have the same competitive dynamics or didn't have the same cable plant already built into their broadband system. And so long story short, the US did really quite well. We had a smaller dip in performance, about 1%, not really a perceptible change in performance with like 30% growth in demand. And we also recovered from that dip much more quickly than some of our peer nations that take a different regulatory approach. And so to my mind, that indicates that our sort of high level system, our basic regulatory framework is quite sound, and the risks of shifting to a different sort of regulatory model are quite high when it comes to weathering these sorts of events. At the same time, the pandemic, and I feel like this is kind of the important point, it's like we're doing fine, the basic model does not need to be changed, but it really highlighted where the gaps in that system are, right? It's like we still struggle with rural infrastructure. There's still parts of the US that don't have adequate broadband infrastructure. And again, that's particularly in rural areas where competition just doesn't, the private actors don't see the return on investment that justifies investing in that sort of widely dispersed populations or covering, combines or tractors out in rural farmland. And so to my mind, that is just a classic example of a market failure where the externalities that private corporations cannot capture, the spillover benefits to all of society are much greater than can be made by private companies investing and competing on their own. And so this is a classic case for subsidization of rural broadband infrastructure. There are clever ways that you can structure that and bring in private partners in all sorts of different ways. But I think that's one key area. There are other gaps that were also exposed. I think adoption challenges, especially for low-income Americans, where we see affordability still remains a challenge for at least some Americans. And there again, for a lot of the same logic, for a lot of the same reasons, I think a subsidy, it's like rather than trying to make these big bank shop changes to the way in which our broadband delivery system works, we should focus on solving that gap that was clearly identified from the pandemic with clear, targeted, smart policies to improve affordability and also make sure that students are online. Education is another huge issue. But yeah, with that, I'm sure Mina has other thoughts on that as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Mina. Thoughts?
I think in some ways, COVID-19 actually uncovered the structural inequity and also the digital divide. I mean, almost overnight, we all had to go to online for work, for education, for grocery shopping, I mean, even our social activity all. And Jim, as you mentioned, even like, the panels and conferences and all went to online. And I think that is where we noticed that how much accessibility and also affording to access that, how important is it? And in the county that I live, and I'm sure we're not the only one, 30% of the population do not have the sufficient access to the broadband for their, like now is an essential need of the daily that, where a lot of our students are online, like both at the higher education and also schools. So we don't that is a really challenge there. And I think one of the things that Robin mentioned, that maybe not everything has to come from at the federal level, and some of the things how can we address it locally? Actually, Chattanooga has a couple of things that we have done here in response to this. For those that don't know, our power company here, EPB, is a power and communication company. They own the fiber optic, and they have they've installed about 10,000 miles of fiber optic throughout the city that covers the 600 square mile territory service that provides opportunity of fiber access to every household and business here in Chattanooga. and the internet can be up to 100 gig, so you can have that if it's needed. But even as I mentioned, even here in our county, the 30% of the population did not have sufficient access. What happened was a group of a number of partners came together. That was which was part of it was led with the Enterprise Center here in Chattanooga, and the power company, the county, the city, and some philanthropic partners came together, and they have done two things so far. One was they expand access to public Wi-Fi. Hundreds of new access points that were installed throughout the city to improve the access. And also one of the things that was done was the school, the Hamilton County school system, now they are having this initiative through EPB, our power company, which was a $15 million initiative to provide no-cost home access internet of 100 megabit per second symmetrical broadband access to about almost 20,000 students that are the disadvantaged families, basically, that they can have access to internet. So I think it's when we look at it from the perspective of understanding that where are the inequity is and how can we both at the local level and state level address it. And Jim, you also so what I was talking about from what my perspective is more urban, but I think you also mentioned rural, that I think Doc kind of covered that part as well. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Mina. And thank you, Doug. I'm going to take a brief commercial break. I want to talk a little bit more about the US Heartland China Association and the membership opportunity. And, you know, the question you have to ask yourself, are you a bridge builder? Do you have a passion for Heartland region? Do you see the ability for us to strengthen the cultural, educational, and business ties between our two countries? If so, I'd encourage you to become a member. And it's a modest fee to become an individual member. It's just $125 a year. So I'd highly encourage you to get with Min and become a member. It'll give you an opportunity to join these sessions along with the members-only sessions that we do, along with potential delegations that will travel to China in the future. So again, please consider becoming a member of the USHCA. I'm going to now shift back to Spencer and talk a little bit about global trends and partnership opportunities. Spencer, talk a little bit about how China's infrastructure compares to the US's over time, and how we maybe can learn from one another on improving our infrastructure and China improving their infrastructure.
So China, you know, there's been a lot of coverage in the news over the years about many of the sort of showcase projects that China's been able to achieve, or just the achievements in infrastructure. So we've seen, for instance, the enormous strides with respect to their high-speed rail. More than 700 cities are connected by high-speed rail now in China. They have extensive, as I mentioned, last-mile logistics, especially their port infrastructure. The port of Yantian, for instance, in Shenzhen is enormous. So I've had the opportunity to visit there, and you know, it's very humbling how large their capacity, their capability is. There's the longest sea bridge in the world. So there are a lot of showcase projects, but I think that sort of obscures from the bigger story that China still has a lot of space for investment in infrastructure. You know, China's still a developing economy. China still, despite all of this, there are still extensive parts of the country that are underserved by infrastructure, including not just the hinterland areas, so the vast parts of the country on the central and western parts, and the southwestern parts as well, that have, you know, mountainous terrain or are less, you know, just a lot more impoverished. So there's a lot more, you know, China's got a lot of catch up to do, despite all of the attention that's been played about what they've done so far, which is really impressive over the years. You know, I think about, the other thing too is I think about the first time I went to China was 2001, and I was struck by all of the farmers that had cell phones, and there are no landlines, just cell phones. And I think infrastructure is a similar thing, where a lot of developing economies, almost it's an advantage in some respects that they don't have all of that. They don't inherit a lot of existing older infrastructure, so they can kind of make the leap and go to the next thing. And I think that's been a big reason why China's been able to invest so much in high-speed rail, sense, because there's not enough rail network to begin with. So they're able to leap ahead and invest in the latest and greatest infrastructure technology. That being said, I think that there are some you know, things we can learn for sure from China, which I'll talk about, but I also think that there's things that we should be cautious about. with respect to what China's been able to accomplish. And these are more just important differences. So as I mentioned, to draw a direct comparison with the US is difficult because, again, China is a developing economy. It's still playing catch up. It's still arguably underinvested in physical capital relative to its size. And there's also, of course, the divergent political system. So a lot of what China can get done is in part a function of the fact that it's a one-party system. It's a one-party state, which is not easy to replicate. Obviously, some of the achievements in a democracy, we have a lot more bureaucratic layers in many respects when it comes to permitting and regulation and so forth. And also the fact that a lot of, there's an incentive structure too with local governments. So a lot of local governments have been the main drivers of infrastructure investment, especially since 2008, 2009 during the global recession. But a lot of that, a lot of party cadres have traditionally been evaluated based on GDP growth and investment, but not the quality of that investment. So you've seen, China has its own bridges to nowhere, for instance, but cadres have long been evaluated in their performance metrics based on that. The other thing too is that the land and property rights regime in China is much different. No one owns land in China. So the land's either owned by the government, by the state, or by the rural collective. And so, we talk about eminent domain in the US as being a significant barrier sometimes, or property rights. And, vast majority of Chinese infrastructure is being done in the countryside, and it's much easier to seize that land. There's less, less barriers to seizing of land for major, especially national scale projects. So that's another key difference. And then also the state enterprises are the primary implementers of or contractors for those projects. And that's the case both in China as well as overseas as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, is that they're primarily done by state enterprises. And those state enterprises are gargantuan in scale. I mean, one of the largest companies in China is the China Rail, and sometimes there are problems. There's been some notable corruption cases, especially the head of China Rail back in 2014 was sentenced to death for corruption. So those are those issues as well. Sorry, and the last thing I'd say is that there is a lot of opacity in financing, so that their financing structure for projects is much different than the U.S. They have what's called a local government investment vehicle structure. So during the 2008-2009 recession, there was the extensive proliferation of these so-called essentially shell companies that would borrow on behalf of local governments to make those investments. The local governments were not legally allowed to borrow money. So those are all the big differences that I would not recommend we emulate in the US as lessons. But I do think that there are a lot of really exciting things going on in China that we can learn from. We already talked a little bit, Doug and Mina talked about 5G, for instance. China's been really a huge investor in 5G. There's the two conferences, is what it's called. So the People's Congress and the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference happened early this year, and they call it the two meetings. And one of the big takeaways was the investment in 5G infrastructure and smart infrastructure, so integration of the digital economy and infrastructure. So they're making a lot of advancements in cutting edge technology, including 5G, big data, AI, and integrate that into how to integrate that into infrastructure. And China has definitely far more embraced, I think, the US mobile technology, mobile apps, smart cities. So there's a lot we can learn there as well. And also, just lastly, just the scale of the planning and the vision and having a much broader strategic plan. I mean, China, again, it's a function of them being, a one-party system with a lot of still central planning. But one of the benefits is that they can really tackle some of these huge problems without all of the stuff that we experience and, all of the legislation and so forth, like in DC. So, as I mentioned before about the Sponge City Initiative is one, for example, $300 billion project to vastly improve and upgrade stormwater management. But there's a whole slew of projects, and China has to do with planning agency, which is called the National Development Reform Commission, is able to have a long-term strategy. And anything China is extremely, they're very strategic and have long-term plans that you typically don't see in the US. So I think there's a lot to learn there as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Talk a little bit about finance. You touched on it, and we hear and read about the Chinese financial institutions having large deposits and growing coffers. Is there opportunity for U.S. to benefit or access that?
Well, I think it's a little tricky. Like, so if for overseas investments, you know, China with the Belt and Road Initiative, one of the key implicit stipulations for a lot of the Belt and Road Initiative projects globally that China's been involved with is that the prime contractor for those projects is actually a Chinese state enterprise. So even though the financing, which is typically done in fact through the China Development Bank, the two main entities for financing those projects are the China Development Bank and then the EXIM Bank, China EXIM Bank. And so they finance the vast majority of those projects, and those projects are invested with a you know, a requirement essentially that the prime contractor, no matter where that project is not the domestic indigenous company, but it would be a Chinese state enterprise. And part of that is also a function of the fact that Chinese state enterprises are so gargantuan and have such capabilities that they're actually better suited in many cases anyways. But that would make it difficult, I think. And then the political climate right now is really hard for US companies to participate in that way, I think, with Chinese companies. A lot of the Belt and Road Initiative projects, there's a lot of, I think, misunderstandings about the BRI, and a lot of sort of assumptions that might not be entirely correct, but a lot of them are, it is viewed by US national security analysts, for instance, often as a hedging strategy. So, you know, diversion of energy resources, energy pipelines to evade a potential conflagration with the US at some point. So I think there's a lot of difficulty around, given those projects are primarily funded by Chinese state banks, CDB and EXIM Bank, it would be difficult for US companies to access those funds. But that could be different for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which was spearheaded by China, but is a multilateral institution. So there could be opportunities there.
Good, thank you, Spencer. I'm going to change now topics to new technologies and ask Mina to talk a little bit about smart road technologies and how do we implement those, and what are some of those more progressive states doing as far as advancing their public-private partnerships with smart road technology. Mina, could you talk a little bit about that and what you're seeing? You're on mute, Mina. Thank you. Good. All right, thanks.
I think a smart road is a very broad term, but we are living in an era of Internet of Things, connectivity, I mean, the places that they exist, information technologies. We talked about, Spencer was talking about artificial intelligence and big data. So these are, and I think perhaps in the whole era of this that we have talked about, road have been the ones that they have been maybe overlooked in terms of the advanced technologies there. And depending on what is being implemented, the way I see the smart road is how can we make roads more observable? How can we see that the wear and tear of the roads, the congestion, the air quality, the energy consumptions? There are a lot of things that how can we know more about the roads? And this can be part of the highway. It can be the rural area or urban area, that we will be able to observe what is going on, because I think that's the first key part, that we need to know that. And then based on what we are seeing, we can make the decision. We can make a decision of how can we improve it, and perhaps how can we mitigate some of the issues that currently exist for future. And in terms of what is going on, I think many different levels of smart roads are being implemented in different cities and different states, and it's for different purposes. Like I think in South Georgia, they're part of the highways that are making it with solar panels, and they are generating, and they have storage facilities there as well. And there are other states that they are implementing different sensors and connectivity, which is always a challenge there as well, because if you have sensors and you don't have the connectivity or the computation capability, then what are you going to be doing with the data that you are collecting there? But there are part of the highways that are equipped with different sensors for different applications. Like, for example, if you know that there are ice on the road, if you know that, or even, you know, there was as simple as, if we are going to be doing de-icing, do you want to use the salt everywhere throughout the area, or are there areas that needs more attention? So I think there are many different things that we can learn from the smart roads. And in terms of if there is any city or state that it's completely have smart roads, no, but these are all based on new technologies that are being implemented, are being tested, and private-public partnerships are very important in that because in fact, there are a lot of entrepreneurial models out there that are they're progressing way faster, and I think those partnerships can help with these. I can talk about state of Tennessee. There are some activities going on in Memphis, there are in Nashville, there are in Chattanooga, and there are several states that they have also part of their interstates covered with the sensors. And I think at this point, we're all kind of like making it more observable and understanding what's going on.
Excellent. Doug, one of the things that Mina touched upon was the connectivity and with smart roads, not only that, but also driverless cars and automated vehicles. What are your thoughts on that ability? And will we, and this may be a question for all the panelists, will we see autonomous cars 10 years from now on the road?
Sure, yeah. I can speak at least to the connectivity issues, looking into the future on whether or not we'll see autonomous cars. Not quite my area of expertise, but yeah, connectivity for transportation for smart roads and for autonomous cars is of course a huge issue. I'm trying to decide this. I don't want to bore the audience with it. There's been a long-running debate over the right use of spectrum for these sorts of intelligent vehicle transportation tools in order to provide connectivity both between cars, vehicle connectivity, or vehicle to infrastructure, so that everyone's kind of communicating and knows where the cars are in space as compared to pedestrians or infrastructure or other vehicles. So there's been a long-running debate, and so I feel like this issue has been to some extent delayed by a sort of lack of consensus around both the protocols, the standards that will be used for this technology, and the appropriate use of spectrum. Whether this is the type of thing that is so specialized that we need a particular band of spectrum set aside just for vehicle communications. In some ways, I think that's reasonable, right? It's like you have vehicles traveling at high speed that need protection from the risk of interference from any other technologies around them. Or is this, sort of like the transition we've seen in so many other areas of spectrum policy, where you want to see general purpose networks that see large economies of scale that can be, easily deployed to a variety of different tools, things like, the mass sort of mobile connectivity infrastructure we already have out there. If you want this to be, one more application riding on top of those, it seems that this is sort of tipping towards the latter, that we're having 5G tools, 5G infrastructure that provides those communication tools, and then a specialized flavor of 5G that's built into vehicles, the protocol that's based on the sort of basic 5G systems to be able to communicate with the infrastructure around them. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity now that we're kind of seeing this critical mass within industry, and also resolving some of the disagreements within the federal government. Different agencies see this issue differently. But if we can see a critical mass, and then really get the ball rolling and get everyone on board, especially if it's on a large interoperable platform that everyone can agree on. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. It's a long story, but yeah.
All right, so Robin, I'm not going to be so kind to you. Doug did a great job of dodging my question. This is a yes or no question. In 10 years, will the majority of the vehicles on the road be autonomous? Yes or no?
Can I backtrack for a second? I just want to go back. No, not for that. I'll get to there. But when we're talking about, smart roads and everything, there are other things too. There's also what we call health monitors. And just for example, the new Mario Cuomo Bridge, it's in New York. It replaced the Tappan Zee Bridge. It has 300 sensors on it to determine its health. And why is that important? It gets back to that maintenance issue. It gets to the asset management issue. So it's not just smart cities and smart roads as far as how do you make traffic work better and other things like that. It's also monitoring, and Mina touched on it, the condition of the roads, the condition of the bridge. Yes or no? Let's put it this way. I heard on the news, I saw a report last night on the news about flying cars. So maybe we will not need autonomous vehicles. We will be going right to flying cars, and they had one shown in the news. So no, 10 years, there may be elements of it. We already have it in our cars in the sense of they self-park and do other things, but I'll leave it at that.
Mina, yes or no?
No, we would see the penetration of driverless vehicles, but we are not going to be 100%. I mean, it's other than technology. Just think about the cost and adapt, and how are we as human and citizens are going to be adapted to that as well. And I think that was one of the questions in the chat as well about the human factor of that. Yes.
All right, and Spencer.
Not my area of expertise, but I say no, because I think that even if the technology is there, I don't think culturally people are willing to fully embrace fully autonomous vehicles.
Perfect. I'm going to switch now and do a quick advertisement again before we go to talking about the future and then taking some of the questions that have been submitted on the chat. Min, would you please put up the promotion for the next event that's coming up this week that Spencer will be hosting on unpacking China's Belt and Road Initiative. It'll be at 9 Pacific time, which would be noon Eastern time on Thursday. So I hope you can join and hear Spencer talk about his insights on the Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you, Min, for putting that up. We're now going to talk a little bit about the future, and this again for all panelists. Maybe I'll start with Robin. What do you think the opportunity and cost will be of the U.S. having, not having our infrastructure improved and continue to live with this poor infrastructure? What's the impact, and what's the ASCE's perspective on that?
Well, we have been doing studies on that. We're actually in the process of updating them. And honestly, I forget the year. It's called Failure to Act Economic Series that quantifies what it's actually costing people. And it was $3,400 a year per family. So when you talk about, and that year was 2016, so we're updating it. And when you talk about that, how to finance, well, that's a hidden tax. Families are paying that a year right now. We just finished some of these studies, and a recent one shows that surface transportation, which just came out this month, that it could cost a household as high as $12,500 over 20 years, which is $625 a year out of pocket. Where's that money going to? Brakes, lost time, tires, all sorts of reasons where those costs are coming from. So it really is critical that we change things around. Our electricity infrastructure, we have an update on that. And so between the years like 2020 and 2039, each household could be losing about $5,800 over that time period. Again, loss of service, why? Why is it costing us? So when people talk about, well, where's the money going to come from? Well, it's already coming from everybody's pocket. And wouldn't it be better to invest that in something that is going to be usable into the future, and so you're not essentially throwing it out, you're actually investing it in what we need. So it is really serious that why we really need to do the investment now. Our GDP is low compared to other first world countries, for lack of a better term, and it's just getting lower. You talked about, some people have asked about the COVID impact. We actually just did a report card specifically on the COVID and showing where the needs are there. Again, it has to do with prioritizing what needs to be done now, because we do have limited funds, but that's how we have to be smart about it. And again, get to those life cycle costs.
Excellent. Maybe for all the panelists, let's talk a little bit about the future and climate change and the impact upon some of the traditional approaches in infrastructure, such as rising sea levels, constant flooding, forest fires, etc. Spencer, what are some of your thoughts on how we address climate change as we look at infrastructure investing?
Well, I mean, climate change is definitely, climate change is definly is challenging our existing infrastructure. With rising sea levels, for instance, it's going to seriously compromise a lot of our cities that are coastal. this is not my area per se, but just my understanding is it's going to impact a lot of the cities, coastal cities, and require a lot more investments in seawalls or improved seawalls and other kinds of infrastructure to mitigate some of the worst impacts of climate change. And then, of course, in addition to being defensive, we want to be offensive about climate change. So we want to invest in infrastructure that is greener and encourages, for instance, in transportation, greater mass transit, for instance, or other modes of transportation that help to remove a large amount of carbon emissions from the air. So I think that it's sort of a two-pronged approach. I think with respect to competition and being competitive, definitely, looking at ways where if climate change could potentially compromise our port systems and our infrastructure, that could make it more difficult for parts of the country to be able to export products abroad or raise the cost of doing that. That would be another consideration as well. So again, looking at our ports, building bulwarking infrastructure to mitigate some of those costs from rising sea levels, for instance.
Robin, any thoughts to this question about taking a different approach as we look at climate change?
Yes, and we certainly are as an industry. We just happened to have ASAE had a technical conference last week, and a couple of speakers talked about how we are building a New York City every month globally.
Wow.
Huge, huge. So what is that doing? That's adding to the problems of climate change when you talk about the greenhouse gases and on other emissions. The construction industry is one of the worst abusers or being the ones who produce a lot of those emissions. So where's the research going? Where are things going? Some has to do with materials. Concrete's one of the worst because of the Portland cement and what it takes to create the Portland cement, which is one element of concrete. So they're looking into different ways of using the same concept of what Portland cement does, which is a binder of the sand and water and rocks, the aggregate, but to have it less of a carbon emission type of process. We are also looking at, when you talk about sea level rise, that's a big one. It's happening already. Wildfires, climate change. We have more drought in some areas, so we're having all these wildfires. So what you're trying to do is hedge your bets against the future. One thing has to do with how you design things. If you're designing a barrier like a levee, or levee, depending how you pronounce it, to keep the water back, you design it in such a way that you can raise it in the future as water rises. You can add to it. If you get into the technical stuff, it has to do with the foundation, but you make it stronger for future growth so that you don't have to tear it all out and start all over again. There are models out there and they've got big gaps in them. So you're trying to do predictive analyses, but they only go so far. So you're trying to look to that. But it's kind of interesting. We talk about the autonomous vehicles. First of all, you have to have very good infrastructure for them. No potholes, none of that. But on some levels, that's kind of contradictory to getting rid of those carbon gas emissions. If we have more cars out because they're actually roaming around without anybody in them, that's even worse than even having one person in them, the driver. So, we've got some contradiction things going on how to deal with it, but we absolutely have to. There's just no question of the data, how the things have changed. We've had more rain in the areas, we've had less rain in areas, we have sea level rising, and those things have all been able to be measured. So we've got to do everything we can to try and hedge our bets as we move into the future.
Excellent. In our chat room, we have one person that actually commented about smart roads, smart vehicles, said, don't we need to have smart people as well? So I won't go there, but I'm going to ask Mina if she'll talk a little bit about climate change and the impact upon how we look at infrastructure.
Actually, transportation is responsible for the most amount of gas, the greenhouse emissions more than any other sector. And I think the latest innovation would be to reduce that would be the conversion from fossil fuels to electrification. But that also has its own challenges that now we need other technologies to make sure that we can accommodate this change. And there are a lot of activities going on with solar arrays and storage facilities that we can accommodate, now that we are going to have more EVs and penetration of more of those. And there are also, at least from the research perspective, there are a lot of work, research toward net zero carbon footprints. That would be basically optimization of the systems in transportation. Like one of the things that, for example, we are looking into is the optimization of traffic control systems, so that we don't have cars sitting there and idle. These are small things, but they are going to have huge impacts if we look at it from many different layers.
Excellent. Doug, any thoughts on climate change?
Sure. Yeah, just really quick. Again, my mind goes back to broadband, right? It's like there are the direct impacts to having greater connectivity to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. When you talk about just reduction in the need for transportation, when you have so many meetings or medical discussions with your doctor or whatever, right, that can take place over video, over broadband, that can eliminate some unnecessary traffic. You also have, connectivity is only a component, right? But if you move towards a smart grid where we can have much more efficient energy usage, and again, not exactly my area of expertise, but to some extent, right, you need connectivity to be able to pull information off of the smart grid to enable more efficient electrical grid to begin with. But then also, I think, and again, this goes back to so many of the positive externalities, right? The spillover benefits of a widely deployed rural wireless infrastructure. When you start talking about precision agriculture, precision forestry, there are all sorts of tools through remote sensing, UAVs, that can make our management of these wildfires or more efficient use of resources that can reduce the long-term effect of climate change through this more precise tools that need to be connected through wireless infrastructure. I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Thank you, Doug.
Jim, I wanted to emphasize something that Mina said, getting rid of the fossil fuels, and people say electricity, but of course we have to talk about what we call the clean energy, because just, electricity needs fuel of some sort to work too. And to go back to the earlier question you asked about the candidates for the presidency, in Joe Biden's plan, he does seem to have an emphasis on clean energy.
Good. Thank you, Rob. Min, I'm going to ask you to come back on with us, please. We've got about 5 minutes, and there's some chat room questions that maybe you can help guide us through as we close out the session. So, Min, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Great, thank you. First of all, and we have too many questions than the time we have. I think our panelists, if you want to scan through really quickly, if there's one burning question for you, you want to raise your finger. We can, next 5 minutes, you can see if you can respond to any of them. So Jim, I'll give the option to our speakers. Anyone see a question they have time to address? I know, Doug, there's one about dual 5G, competing 5G network.
Sure, yeah. This is probably a topic that deserves a much broader conversation. But yeah, I think I saw the question is is there a risk of two different 5G standards, right? A sort of Huawei ZTE Chinese version and then a Western version. I tend to think that the risk of that is relatively low. Historically, Chinese companies and some of the state-owned enterprises, the China Mobile, the network operators themselves, have focused on their own versions of standards that have, to some extent, for very good technical reasons, right? There were good technological choices, but were also used as a way to sort of keep the market closed off from other Western suppliers. I think that Huawei and others have moved past that and now are looking much more global in their focus and are aiming to integrate within the global standard setting organization. So I think that they're very much aware that of the opportunity, right, of global market. And so now the conversation has shifted more towards national security concerns around those issues. And so I don't see the risk of being like a lack of interoperability within the technology themselves, but it's much more a political issue more than anything else.
Great. And the rest of the panel, do you see any question that you want to address? please just raise your hand if you do. But there is a question here. I don't see any hands raised. Maybe you already covered the question. There's a question about, can we give some examples how hard infrastructure, roads and dams, and soft infrastructure like broadband, etc., are integrated for a better outcome in a community? I know, Mina, you touched on that on Chattanooga. Any other comments, remarks on that? How the traditional definition infrastructure is working with, I see Doug has got a finger.
Just really quickly, I mean, one of the classic, just obvious policy options for getting better broadband out there widely is a policy called Dig Once. And there are something that it's been attempted through a number of pieces of legislation on the federal level, but a number of cities have taken on. But the basic idea is anytime you're digging up roads to rebuild infrastructure, roads, bridges, to install conduit, even if you're not installing fiber itself, to install sort of plastic pipes that can protect fiber that can then later be pulled through it. And so to make it much, much easier to install broadband infrastructure at a future date, anytime that roads are being worked on. So it's a real obvious, to my mind, option on the table.
Great, thank you. Mina, do you have anything to add?
I think they're so integrated. Honestly, without the soft infrastructure, the broadband, there's not much we can do with the smart road or smart cities. If there's no connectivities, we won't be able to do a lot. We can collect the data if we cannot transmit the data. In some cases, that we have to go back and collect the data. Well, that exists, but if there are things that we're trying to do in real time or closer to real time, if we cannot get the data, there's no point of collecting that data.
Great, thank you. And so one last chance for our speakers. Do you have a question you want to address? We are coming to the 1 minute point of our public program. Again, and thank you for your time. And for the attendees, if you are a guest, a partner who are joining the discussion, you should stay online. And so with that, Jim, with your permission, the speaker, if you don't have any other questions, and we will stop on this public program. And I do want to bring up some upcoming events. And as Jim already mentioned, we have Spencer actually talking about Belt and Road Initiative this Thursday. And we also have a member-only event with partner from Ernst & Young to talk about playing the long game in agriculture. And later, speak of climate change, we have an event about big power responsibility, how US and China can collaborate on climate change. So with that, and we conclude the public program.